Hello, my name is Vojtěch Zachník, and I'm from the University of Hradec Králové in Czech Republic. And I would like to discuss my talk on rules and institutions. So, can we explain cases of disobedient institutional behavior in a simple and comprehensive way? What is the factor that distinguishes norm follower and norm violator, rule breaking, norm evasion, or other forms? Apparently, there seems to be a lot of names for a variety of institutional behavior without any clear idea why is that the case. In this talk, I would like to focus on this particular issue of how to classify different instances of institutional behavior, and more specifically the instances of so-called disobedient behavior. In order to do so, I need first to introduce the main framework inspired by Sellars, which will help me draw a line between many kinds of disobedient institutional behavior. And second, to use this framework to explain why there are so many names for seemingly identical human social behavior. To begin with, the first part, I would like to exploit the older idea of Sellars, and it will help me to lay down the elements of normative attitudes that constitute a rule-following behavior and therefore institutional behavior as well. So what's the idea? Sellars, in some papers, mentions a distinction between O2Bs, or rules of criticism, and O2Dos, calls them rules of action, where the first specify desirability of certain state of affairs, the second specify what action someone ought to do. So also the action prescription. So here are examples how it could work. So it ought to be that people greet each other on streets. This expresses the desirability of greeting pattern. And another case would be I ought to hold the door open for older people, which expresses action prescription for a specific type of situation. This is the basic Sellars idea, and I would like to exploit it a little bit further. So the tuning the instrument. Unlike Sellars, I think it's better to use this distinction as showing that there are two different kinds of normative attitudes, rather than just two types of rules. In case of institutions, understood as rules and equilibria, it simply means that the institution rests on both kinds of normative attitudes. At least this is my assumption. So the example might be like this: traffic lights. It ought to be the case that drivers stop on red and go on green, whereas the O sub ix would be I ought to stop on red and go on green. So it looks trivial, and even Sellars claims that the both O2Bs and O2Dos have an essential connection, because he thinks O2Bs imply O2Dos. But it only holds if I am a subject of the O2Bs and an agent of specific O2Do, as you've seen in traffic light example. But however, and I will show this later, it doesn't have to be true for some social behavior and some cases of norm transgression, since they rely directly on the fact of weakening the link between these two attitudes. So this is basically the main point. And in order to argue for this, I need to ask how can Sellars' idea be developed into more precise and explicatory framework. So to make my point clear, here are several claims I'm willing to accept, and it could be considered as a sort of a bridging argument for my position. So first, most of the contemporary accounts of social institutions rely on the concept of rule. The point number two, I'm much in favor of understanding rule as a cluster of normative attitudes amongst group members, as discussed in a contemporary version of inferentialism. Point number three, Sellars' point help us to shed light on the variety of normative attitudes involved in institutional behavior. And therefore I believe there is a sort of a potential to explain forms of different disobedient behavior by using this refined framework. So to indicate my departure from the original Sellars position, I'm going to use the following distinction for two types of normative attitudes. OA is a shortcut for it ought to be that A holds. So one can view this as a desirability of a state A, and in terms of norm, it expresses what is known as a norm acceptance. Broadly speaking, it records whether individual deems a particular state or principle acceptable, and that principle might be social norm, institutional rule, or law. On the other side, there is a OIX, which is a shortcut for agent I ought to do X. I believe it's a shortcut for action prescription or commands to carry out a specific action. As such, it shows whether one thinks he should be acting in accordance with a norm. It seems similar, but I think there are several points that are quite different from what Sellars intended to show. But yeah, I think this will provide me a good structure for the part number 2, analysis and application. So the question is, can we explain cases such as norm evasion, non-conformity, norm following, or persistence of unpopular norms and laws within this simple framework? I would like to stop a little bit here and recap what I've claimed so far. So it seems I've reached very little. I've just got a minimal framework with two types of normative attitudes, which seems more like a bare bone that needs a little bit of flesh to make it more functional. But now, I would like to show a general schema and some other components that play a role in human institutional behavior, and I will do that by investigating few typological cases of disobedient behavior. So the ideal case seems to be acting according to a social institution, and it seems that there is a general agreement, or at least statement, for that if that there is someone who is indifferent to or even disagrees with the norm's content, then the person will avoid conformity if no sanction is present, whereas someone who supports the norm will tend to conform even if no punishment looms. This is a big hairy quotation, but I think it expresses general statement or general agreement in social ontology. And I think we can very easily model this case by using my framework. So as you can see, there is a norm follower who accepts certain principle A and also acts accordingly, and norm opposer who disagrees and also doesn't act accordingly, the principle and also the action X. But the puzzle is here. How about the other combinations of attitudes? So here's a scenario number 1, norm conformity. In the literature, it seems that authors regularly distinguish cases of norm following and norm conformity. I think it's one can model this as a case when one does not accept a certain state of A or principle A, yet he or she acts accordingly. And the question is why? Well, the crucial factor here are sanctions in this model scenario, and the explanation is quite simple. Well, agents have instrumental reason to conform with the rule because they are motivated by sanctions. In terms of behavior, we might simply observe conformity because, however, there is a hidden divergence in attitudes, but some members of society disagree with the institutions and some other will agree. So those who disagree, they do not follow, but they only conform. And I think this schema allows me to simply map this as something that is that might be behaviorally the same, but differs in normative attitudes, and the underlying mechanism is sanctions. So here the scenario number 2. It has a similar structure of normative attitudes, but it's it's not the case that OA holds, but agent A again ought to do X. I'm sorry. So what explains the second part, the OIX part, is the fact that even though some members of society disagree with A, however, they acknowledge the legitimacy of higher power to create OA. Well, this example is perhaps better explained in a simple example. So imagine football scenario. The football players ought to be present 30 minutes before the game starts. So here we have OA. And I might simply disagree with this because I think it's a waste of my time, but I respect that because it was decided by the captain of our team, and therefore I act accordingly. So the crucial factor here is acknowledgement of the legitimacy of higher power. The emphasis is therefore placed on the first component, OA, which in turn reinforces action prescription part. So now we see that we have two scenarios with the same normative structure, but some underlying factors are different, and there might be different motivations for the action. And I believe that a structural similar scenario would be, for instance, pluralistic ignorance, as discussed in Big Theory's work, where crucial factor would be epistemic, false normative expectation supporting action prescription. So there will be another component influencing the same normative structure. I think there is a important note, because these cases show that the person might be conforming behaviorally despite his disagreement about the desirability of the state A, or one could say despite his opposing personal normative beliefs. Therefore, such cases could be possible sources of disobedient behavior once those additional conditions are weakened. For instance, lowering sanctions, absence of monitoring, or just higher power is discredited. I call it perhaps as latent disobedience, but I'm not sure about this right now. So how about the cases when OA actually holds, but agents do not act accordingly? So there is a different structure of normative attitudes. One scenario might be case of norm evasion. In this situation, people accept a certain institution, nonetheless, they do not conform. And what makes it different from pure conformity case is that people agree with the A, but their evasive behavior typically occurs privately and due to a deliberate decision, because it carries some personal benefit for them, and it motivates them to evade. So here we have OA, but it's not the case that they ought to do X. And as such, it might be rare in its occurrence, but dangerous because it undermines an established practice. And to illustrate this case, this scenario, imagine a community where food sharing norm exists, but members secretly hunt during a night to avoid giving a share. So what's typical for norm evasion scenario is that people generally accept the norm, but some will exploit the fact that their behavior is difficult to detect. So it seems to me that the crucial factor here is asymmetric information that weakens the action prescription part. Another case would be a conflicting information scenario where the schema would be the same. So this is a much more typical case, usually discussed in the literature, because norm is accepted, but agent does not do what is required because his normative attitude towards the action is weakened by his expectations about others, either empirical or normative. And the crucial factor is social expectation. So we may say disobedient agent may believe that others will not do what is required, or that they do not expect him to do his part, and therefore he is likely to hold the attitude that he ought not to do X as well. So the explanation what is exploited here is the factor of conditional preference, which is well documented in cases of social norms and conventions. But again, there is the similar normative scheme as in the previous scenario, but the different underlying mechanism. And I believe we can classify all these cases as perhaps many more by using this grid or framework I've tried to set up in this talk. So we have two different normative attitudes, different effective factors. I think it might be also helpful to add whether the effective factor is reinforcing or weakening. So there will be different effect, but this is something I would like to continue even further for next couple of months. So this is much work in progress. But yeah. So just let me recap a little bit. Let me summarize. I've started with an intuition that it might be useful to consider Sellars' distinction between ought to be and ought to do to explain some cases of disobedient institutional behavior. This led me to a slightly improved framework with just two different normative attitudes, and I tried to show possible combinations of these attitudes, which helped me to systematically capture some known cases of disobedient behavior. I admit it's far from complete, but I hope this analysis illustrates the basic structure that I would like to refine even further. So I already have in mind some possibilities for future development, but I need to give it a bit more time and effort to develop it even further. And this is basically the schema I'm working with right now, and I'd be very happy for your comments and inputs. So thank you all for listening, and I'm looking forward for your objections and comments.